okay, let's walk through this. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke, right? So the problems are, let's say, the tragedy of the world, the malevolence of the human heart, and the tyranny of the state. And like, those are, if you don't understand that you would run from those problems when you really looked at them, then you haven't considered the problems. And they exist at all levels, right? It's not just the social and the political or the economic, it's also the psychological. It's like, well, human malevolence. There's an abyss. That's a hellish abyss. And it plays itself out in the political world, but it plays itself out in your own world too, in your psychological world. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the hydra, that's the gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you like you're a prey animal and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it.
Yeah.
And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Think, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. So, yeah, there's lots of reasons to, because I've thought for a long time, imagine you have a choice in front of you, because you do. So here's the choice. Your life is either meaningful or meaningless. Okay, so let's go through the meaningless part first. Because you think, well, of course I don't want it to be meaningless. It's like, yeah, just hold on a second. Nothing you do matters. And so impulsive pleasure is the order of the day. No responsibility. You can do whatever you want. It's like Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, right? Or it's like Neverland in Peter Pan. You're still a kid. You can play all the time.
Yeah.
Impulsive pleasure and no responsibility. That's the reward for meaninglessness. Okay. Think, well, there's something to be said about that.
And powerlessness to a certain degree. Yeah.
Well, but then the other side is, okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters, right? You make a mistake, hurts you, hurts your family, hurts the world in a deeper way than you think. And you have to be awake to that. And then you have to take it on yourself. It's one thing I understood probably over the last 5 years. I was trying to understand this idea. There's an idea that Christ is the person who takes on the sins of the world onto himself. I thought, what does that mean? Because there's a redemptive idea there, right? So the idea is the Redeemer, the person who redeems everyone is the person who takes the sins of the world onto himself. What does it mean?
Radical
it means it's your fault, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything, the whole bit.
And I think people get tripped up also because at the moment where you admit to yourself that you have the potential to change something, you have to admit to yourself that you've always had the potential to change something. So you have to go back in this recapitulation of everything that you've done and actually confront what you haven't done and all the people you've hurt and all the things, the ways that you've hurt yourself, all the ways that you could have done better. And if that judge is too strong and too harsh and wants to punish you too severely, you say, no, judge, I had no power. Yeah. I'm going to stay here in hell in powerlessness with everybody else because of the oppressive forces that are out there. I don't take any responsibility. But that fucking courage of going, hey, I am responsible for myself and I can make a difference. And I've fucked up in the past and I will fuck up again, but I'm going to own this. That is the true hero's choice.
Yeah, well, it's also the fact that you're fallible is no excuse for not taking responsibility.
Right.
When Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which, is one of the things that brought the terrible Soviet Empire to a standstill, that book, he did that. He said he went over his whole life with a fine-tooth comb, every single thing. When he was in prison, he realized that he had done many things that put him in prison. So there, he was in two kinds of prisons. He was in the prison the Soviet state produced. And then he was in the prison that the Soviet state produced, that he participated in producing, that then imprisoned him, both at the same time. And so when he figured that out, he thought, okay, well, what did I do in my life to increase the probability that I would end up where I ended up? And so he said he went over his life with a fine-tooth comb. And his question was, is there something I can do now to atone for what I failed to do in the past? And I mean, that was a serious question. He wasn't playing a game. That's why he, could memorize a 1,500-page book, essentially. I mean, it was no game. And the consequences of that were literally world-changing. So that's an interesting thing. Well, so let's say you go over your past with a fine-tooth comb and you decide you're going to take responsibility for everything that you did that was wrong and everything that you failed to do that you could have done that was right. It's like, does that change the world? It's like, depends on how thoroughly you do it. You might say it changes the world like nothing else possibly can. And I think that that's actually right.
Yeah.
And that's also a frightening thought, because it means that things would be way better than they are if you weren't so damn useless.
Yeah. And really the truth of the matter is, even if you can't, if you're doing the math, doing the arithmetic, you can't actually account in the amount of time and the amount of damage and whatever. You can't actually make up for it. Doesn't matter, because all you have is now. And all you have is the ability to charge out and do your fucking best. Like,
well, that's part of that moderation that you were talking about. You don't want the judge to be so harsh that you can do nothing but cut your throat, right? Because that can happen to people as they get so guilty and so overwhelmed by what they've done. And sometimes that's part of a pathological process. They're ill in some sense. You don't want to, the answer to how you pay for your past sins isn't by jumping off a bridge. It's the wrong answer.
It isn't constantly lashing yourself and keeping you in hell for the hell that you've created prior.
Right.
The penance is actually striving out forward with love and with heart and with change and with service. Like, that's how you make up for it, not by punishing yourself, by actually driving yourself towards your fears to slay the dragons, to ease the suffering of the world.
Well, I think about it the way, what you do when you have a child. If you love the child, is like the child makes a mistake and you think, well, you can't allow that. So there's a disciplinary element there. Well, what's the purpose of the discipline? To decrease the probability of repetition of the mistake. That's all. So you use the minimal necessary force. I wrote about that in chapter 5. Minimal necessary force necessary to attain that. And you do the same thing with yourself. It's like, well, how much do you need to be beat up? Enough so you fix the problem. No more than that. Minimal necessary force. It's a great English common law principle. Maybe the greatest, although there's a number of them, but that one's really up there. So don't hit anything harder than it needs to be hit. That's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Well, that is the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb, I think, is...
That's a fucked up rule.
It is. Although what it replaced was even worse. So,
To think of that as an improvement is also a scary thing.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
To think about as well.
Yeah.